Hi everyone. Today, I will discuss to you the revised quarantine rules and regulations of 2004, the part 2, part 3, and part 4. And let's start first with the part 2. Let's start first with the part 2, which entitled Requirements of Vessels Upon Entry from Foreign Port. Section 7. Vessels to be inspected. All vessels coming from the foreign ports are subject to quarantine inspection upon entry in any port of the Philippines. Vessels declared in one port in the Philippines are deemed clear out for all other ports in the country except in cases of any vessel with an infectious disease subject to the regulations, emerging disease, public health emergency of international concern, and or death on board. Section 8. Requirements for vessels to be inspected. Any vessel coming from foreign ports subject to quarantine inspection shall be considered in quarantine until given a pratique. Such vessel shall fly a yellow flag at its foremast upon entry into the harbor, drop its anchor at the quarantine anchorage, put down its accommodation ladder, and wait for the quarantine medical officer. During inclement weathering conditions, a proper shelter or lee should be afforded to the quarantine boarding officer before the boarding formality can be conducted. In cases of extreme weather condition, the boarding formality could be held in abeyance until such condition would be favorable. Section 9. Requirements from the master of vessels to be inspected. The master of the vessel shall provide the quarantine medical officer the following duly accomplished documents. Duly means the appropriate procedure, like following the appropriate procedure. Maritime declaration of health, the rating or the rating exemption certificate, passenger and crew list, voyage memo, or ports of call, clinical record of cases treated during the voyage, if any, other documents deemed necessary by the quarantine medical officer for the compliance of health regulations. 9.2. The master of any vessel on which a case or suspected case of an infectious disease subject to the regulations, emerging disease exists and or a public health emergency of international concern exists, board shall, as soon as practicable, notify the Bureau of Quarantine at the next port of call or station and shall take such measures to prevent the spread of the disease as the Bureau directs. 9.3. The ship captain may be ordered to master the crew and passengers on board in well-lighted and ventilated place for inspection when deemed necessary. The deck officer in charge of health or the ship surgeon or physician shall provide the quarantine medical officer the medical data of crew or passengers. He shall assist the quarantine medical officer to the sick bay or cabin to examine any patient and review his clinical records for evaluation and management. Section 10. Kinds of pratique or clearance issued to incoming vessels. 10.1. Free pratique. A pratique issued to a vessel which has complied with the quarantine rules and regulations as provided in this IRR. Provisional pratique. A pratique issued to vessels which have the following conditions: isolation of suspect or actual case of infectious disease subject to the regulations, emerging disease or public health emergency of international concern. Next is quarantine or medical surveillance of exposed passenger or crew to an infectious disease, subject to the regulations or emerging disease or public health emergency of international concern. Next, vessel with cargoes which shall pose a public health threat. Gunny snacks or duty bags or cargoes wrapped with the same materials coming from plague-infected countries shall fumigated prior to release to the consignee unless covered by a valid fumigation certificate. Cargoes containing hazardous materials, biological, chemical, or radiological waste, and etc. Next is expired rating or the rating exemption certificate. Next is a vessel suspected of having been exposed to radiological, chemical, or biological RBC incident. 10.3. Controlled free pratique. Direct or direct berthing privilege. A pratique granted to vessel with a request for a direct berthing berthing privilege submitted within 48 hours prior to the estimated time of arrival, duly signed or certified by the master of the vessel with the following conditions. First is there has been no death on board during the voyage. Next is the port visited during the voyage should be stated in the request that no infectious disease subject to the regulations, emerging disease, and or many public health emergency of international concern is present or endemic at the ports of origin. Next is there is no sick person on board, nor was there any case of infectious disease subject to regulations, emerging disease, and or any public health emergency of international concern during the voyage. Next is there has been no death or nor illnesses among captive animals and birds, including rodents, on board during the voyage. And the last is the derating exemption certificate is valid. 10.4 Radio Pratik. A pratik granted to military vessels of the public of the Philippines and foreign countries under the following conditions. First is there should be a ship surgeon on board or any of the vessels operating as a squadron. Next is this request for radio pratik shall be submitted within the 48 hours before the estimated time of arrival. The port visited during the voyage should be stated in the request that no infectious disease subject to regulations, emerging disease, and or any public health emergency of international concern is present or endemic at the ports of origin. Next is there is no sick person on board, nor was there any case of infectious disease subject to the regulations, emerging disease, and or any public health emergency of international concern during the voyage. Next is there has been no death nor illnesses among captive animals, birds, including rodents, on board during the voyage, and the derating exemption certificate is valid. Next is 10.5 Controlled Radio Pratik. A pratik granted to the cruise vessels under the following conditions. This is somehow similar to the radio pratik, but there are conditions that has been added and there are conditions that has been subtracted. The conditions that has been added in this pratik is that the ports visited during the voyage should be stated in the request that no infectious disease subject to the regulations, emerging disease, and or public health emergencies of international concern is present or endemic at the ports of origin. There should be no actual or suspected case on board of an infectious disease subject to regulations, emerging disease, or a public health emergency of international concern. And lastly, the quarantine medical personnel shall board the vessels at the anchorage and conduct quarantine inspection while the vessel is slowly proceeding towards the port. Section 11. Immunization Certificate Requirement. Yellow fever. Travelers arriving from the yellow fever infected areas are required to present valid international certificates of vaccination against yellow fever if arriving within 6 days from that area. The validity of this certificate shall extend for a period of 10 years, beginning 10 days after the date of immunization or re-immunization. The yellow fever vaccination centers in the country accredited by the WHO are quarantined Central Office, Manila, Cebu Quarantine Station, and Davao Quarantine Station. Next is the Director of Quarantine may from time to time prescribe or require immunization from certain diseases if in his discretion such requirements are essential on account of varying public health conditions. Lastly is other vaccinations may be administered upon request. Section 12. Extent and method of quarantine inspection. First is, during the inspection of vessels, the quarantine medical officer shall check the following conditions before granting a pratik to the vessel. First is the state of health of the passengers and crew, existence or non-existence of an infectious disease subject to the regulations, emerging disease, and or public health emergency of international concern for the port of origin or other previous ports of call. Next is sanitary conditions on board. Next is validity of the rating or the rating exemption certificate and state of rat life on board and types of tonnage of cargo. Section 13. boarding of vessel from foreign ports placed under quarantine. 13.1. In case of notification of the presence of suspected cases of infectious disease subject to the regulations, emerging disease, and or public health emergency of international concern and or death on board. 13.1.1. No person is allowed to embark except the quarantine medical officer and or his duly accredited assistants. Next is disembarkation of the passenger and crew is not allowed until such time that the vessel has been granted a quarantine clearance. Next is suspect cases shall be medically evaluated on board and transported to a designated referral hospital for isolation. Next is the remaining passengers and crew of vessel, if the need arises, should be medically evaluated on board the vessel. Next is crew and passengers who may be possibly exposed to an infectious disease, emerging disease, and or public health emergency of international concern may be isolated or undergo voluntary home confinement. Next is any person who boarded a vessel under quarantine without the permission shall be subject to detention and quarantine. And the lastly is 13.2. In cases when the vessel is exposed to radiological, biological, or chemical RBC terrorism, the tailored actions on such incident should be followed in accordance to the chemical, radiological, biological incidents. Section 14. Requirements of vessels before departure. No vessel shall be allowed to depart from any seaport of the Philippines to foreign destination without securing an outgoing quarantine clearance from the director of quarantine or his duly authorized representative. This clearance shall be granted to the vessel on condition that a vessel has observed all quarantine requirements imposed. This clearance shall be a requirement for the granting of a customs clearance for departure. Section 15. Embarkation of travelers for international voyage. The director of quarantine, when he considers it necessary, may order the medical examination of travelers and may disallow of any suspected person having an infectious disease subject to regulations, emerging disease, and or public health emergency of international concern from embarking on an international voyage, except in case of the transport of sick persons by a conveyance especially provided for the purpose, in order to safeguard the health of the passenger and crew. Section 16. Personnel assigned for inspection. The quarantine inspection of vessels shall be conducted by the quarantine medical officer and or a duly accredited assistant designated by the director of quarantine. In seaport where there is no quarantine medical officer, a duly trained physician will be designated by the Undersecretary of Health as acting or alternate quarantine medical officer upon the recommendation of the Director of Quarantine, who shall perform such function on an annual contractual basis. Section 17. Time of vessel quarantine inspection. Inspection of vessels required by this regulation shall be made between 800 to 1,200 hours and 1,300 to 1,700 hours Mondays to Fridays. Any inspection performed outside of these hours and during Saturdays, Sundays, and holidays shall be compensated for, hence reasonable reimbursement by the concerned shipping company may be allowed by the Director of Quarantine in relation to the incurred expenses and services rendered by each quarantine personnel. Next is we will proceed to Part 3, Requirements of Domestic Vessels. Section 18. Vessels to be inspected. All domestic vessels plying domestic ports with the presence of infectious disease subject to the regulations, emerging disease, public health emergency of international concern, and or death on board are subject to quarantine inspection and clearance. In ports where there are no quarantine officials, clearance of the vessels will be coordinated with the local health authorities. Section 19. Requirements for vessels to be inspected. Domestic vessels subject to inspection shall be considered in quarantine until properly cleared. Such vessel shall fly a yellow flag at its foremast upon entry into the harbor, drop its anchor at the quarantine anchorage, put its accommodation ladder, and wait for the quarantine medical officer. During inclement weather conditions, a proper shelter or lease should be afforded to the quarantine boarding officer before the boarding formality can be conducted in cases of extreme weather condition. The boarding formality could be held in abeyance until such condition would be favorable. Section 20. Requirements from the master of vessels to be inspected. First is, the master of vessels shall provide the quarantine medical officer the following duly accomplished documents: clinical record of treated cases during the voyage or the medical incident report of the death on board, the rating or the rating exemption certificate, passenger and crew list, voyage memo, reports of call, other documents deemed necessary by the quarantine medical officer for the compliance of the health regulation based on the guidelines or protocol promulgated by the Bureau of Quarantine. Next is the master of inter-island or domestic vessel on which case or suspected case of an infectious disease subject to regulations, emerging disease, and or public health emergency of international concern exist on board shall, as soon as practicable, notify the Bureau of Quarantine at the next port of call or station and shall take such measures to prevent the spread of the disease as the Bureau directs. And the lastly is, the ship captain may be ordered to master the crew and passengers on board in a well-lighted and ventilated place for inspection when deemed necessary. The deck officer in charge of health or the ship's surgeon physician shall provide the quarantine medical officer the medical data of crew or passengers. He shall assist the quarantine medical officers to the sick bay or cabin to examine any patient and review his clinical records for evaluation and management. Section 21. Immunization requirements. The Director of Quarantine may from time to time prescribe or require immunization from certain diseases if in his discretion such requirements are essential on account of varying public health conditions. Section 22. Extent and method of quarantine inspection. During the inspection of vessels, the quarantine medical officer shall check the following conditions. First is state of health of the passengers and crew. Second is existence or non-existence of an infectious disease subject to the regulations, emerging disease, and or public health emergency of international concern, outbreak of international concern from the port of origin or other previous ports of call. Next is sanitary conditions on board. Next is validity of the rating or the rating exemption certificate and state of rat life on board. And lastly is type and tonnage of cargo. Section 23. Personnel assigned for inspection of inter-island vessel. The quarantine of inspection of vessels shall be conducted by the quarantine medical officer and duly accredited assistants, designated by the Director of Quarantine. In port where there is no quarantine medical officer, a duly trained physician will be designated by the Undersecretary of Health as acting or alternate quarantine medical officer upon the recommendation of the Director of Quarantine shall perform such function on annual contractual basis. Section 24. Boarding of domestic vessel placed under quarantine. First, in case of notification of the presence of suspected cases of infectious disease subject to the regulations, emerging disease, and or public health emergency of international concern and or death on board, no person is allowed to embark except the quarantine medical officer and or his duly accredited assistants. Disembarkation of the passengers and crew is not allowed until such time that the vessel has been granted a quarantine clearance. Suspect cases shall be medically evaluated on board and transported to a designated referral hospital for isolation. The remaining passengers and crew of vessel, if the need arises, should be medically evaluated on board the vessel. crew and passengers who may be possibly exposed to an infectious disease or emerging disease and or public health emergency of international concern may be isolated or undergo voluntary home confinement or quarantine. And lastly is any person who boarded a vessel under quarantine without the permission shall be subject to detention and quarantine. 24.2 In cases when the vessel is exposed to radiological, biological, or chemical terrorism, the tailored actions in such incidents should be followed in accordance to the interim guidelines on preparedness and response to RBC incidents. And now let's proceed to the last part, which is the part 4 requirements of vessels while in port. Section 25 Requirements of vessels while in port. Route guards on mooring connection lines. If the vessel docks alongside the piers, all mooring lines shall be provided with a prescribed route guards not less than 1 meter in diameter and so fixed as to be always at right angle to the line to which it is attached. Next is cargo net, gangway plank, and ramp. All cargo nets should be hauled with not in use. The gangway, plank, and or ramp forward and aft shall be lifted up when not in operation and will lighted throughout the night to prevent the access of rodents. Next is distance of vessel from the dock. All vessels should be fended off at least 1.5 meters from the dock. Mooring of vessel to another vessel which is moored to a dock. A vessel which shall tie alongside another vessel moored to a dock shall institute all necessary measures to prevent the access of rats from one vessel to another. Section 26 Disposal of garbage. No vessel shall be allowed to dump garbage or waste overboard while in the harbor. Garbage should be collected in prescribed containers for disposal. When a vessel is in port, arrangements should be made for the regular removal of garbage by a disposal service in accordance with our environmental and health provisions on waste disposal to ensure that it is properly collected, treated, and disposed of in accordance with existing standards and laws. Section 27 Rat Inspection of Vessels. The following vessels shall be subject to rat inspection while in the harbor: vessels without derating or derating exemption certificate, vessels with expired derating or derating exemption certificate, vessels with a valid derating exemption certificate but with moderate to heavy rat infestation aboard or have visited plague-infected ports. Next, any inspection for rat infestation shall be under supervision of the quarantine medical officer and all findings shall be recorded in the derating inspection form. The rating measure shall be conducted depending on the degree of rat infestation and a corresponding certificate will be issued. Next is kinds of derating certificate. The rating certificate, a certificate being issued after the rating measure has been performed, such as fumigation or rat poisoning and trapping, which is valid for 6 months from the date of issuance. The rating exemption certificate, a certificate being issued when there is no evidence of rat infestation on board and is valid for 6 months from the date of issuance. Extension certificate, a certificate being issued which shall be valid for 1 month from the date of issuance with instruction that formal inspection and issuance of a derating or derating exemption certificate shall be done in the next port authorized to conduct such inspection and issuance of certificate. This certificate can only be issued once. All vessel must have a valid derating certificate or an extension certificate upon arrival and prior to departure. Section 28 Fumigation. The following are subject to fumigation while in the harbor: any vessel with human or rodent plague on board, any vessel moderately or heavily infested with rats or other pests and vermins. Next is cargoes in a vessel from a plague-infected port which are vulnerable to harbor rats and fleas. However, if the cargo is covered by a valid certificate of fumigation from the port of loading, the fumigation may be waived subject to the verification of the authenticity of the certification. And last is inter-island vessels for their periodic annual fumigation. And that's all guys for the part 2, part 3, and part 4. Thank you for listening. God bless you guys and have a great day ahead.